In advance of the January 6th committee's final report, which we expect a week from tomorrow, Talking Points Memo has started publishing many of the texts that former Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows received from 34 Republican lawmakers and others in the run-up to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Now, NBC News has not independently confirmed or reviewed those texts, and there may be some context missing from some of them, but what Talking Points Memo has published so far is alarming. We have known for a long time that a select handful of elected officials, like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, really seem to have drank the Stop the Steal Kool-Aid. Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, advocated for martial law to overturn the results of the 2020 election, spelling it, by the way, like the department store marshals. But anyway, what TPM's reporting makes clear is that Marjorie Taylor Greene was less of an outlier than we thought. Lots of Republican elected officials and people in positions of power were calling for drastic measures to overturn the election and citing conspiracy theories as their reason for doing so. 34 Republican lawmakers were texting Mark Meadows things like YouTube videos explaining that identities of 50 million U.S. citizens were stolen via Ukraine and used for voting in the 2020 election as part of a $100 billion plot involving illegal immigrants, blackmail, and Romanian officials. That's really something that happened. Not the conspiracy theory part, the fact that among the 34 Republican lawmakers that were texting Mark Meadows, some of them believe in that. Or they send stuff like the conspiracy theory that Italian defense contractors somehow used satellites to alter the election results. The chair of the House Freedom Caucus, Scott Perry, was one of the people pushing that particular theory. TPM reports that Perry was fixated on that Italygate conspiracy theory. He bombarded Meadows, the chief of staff, with texts about it, saying he was setting up a cyber team that would seize voting machines around the country and put them under lock and key. Perry was far from alone. TPM's latest piece tonight reports that Mark Meadows was getting similar text about the Italygate conspiracy from a Republican state senator in Georgia. These were elected members of the U.S. government who were re-elected last month and appear to actually believe this stuff. Joining us now is Josh Kovensky. He's an investigative reporter for Talking Points Memo. Josh is part of the TPM team that obtained the new trove of Mark Meadows' text messages and has reported extensively on the ways Meadows was communicating with Republican members of Congress to overturn the results of the 2020 election. Josh, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
So, is this why Mark Meadows fought Congress's subpoena? I mean, this isn't all of the emails. These are just the ones he chose to release. What can you tell us about that selection?
I mean, I think in my view, the most shocking thing about this is that, all of the insane things we're seeing, the Italygate conspiracy theories, the fact that, these wild, just completely baseless theories were being spread among the highest levels of the American government. This is the good stuff. In a sense, this is what Meadows edited and was willing to let the committee have access to. So, I think that in itself tells you that there are things out there that are likely much more damaging. We also have some evidence in the texts themselves. Scott Perry, who you just mentioned, is constantly referencing to chats on Signal, the encrypted messaging app. We even collected some evidence this week to suggest that the just regular SMS text messages that were handed over to Congress, even that isn't a complete record of everything that was sent. So there's much more out there. As far as we understand, what was given to the committee was only a partial record of the full that, exists out there somewhere.
From what you have seen, and, with the caveat that this is not a complete picture of the responses from Meadows or from Scott Perry or the other Republican lawmakers, can you describe the nature of the correspondence when these insane, there's really no other word to describe them, when these insane paranoid conspiracy theories about 2020 election fraud are floated to the White House chief of staff? He doesn't appear to be shooting them down.
Not at all. He's receptive. And that's what's so fascinating about it, in a sense, is that, I think I would say that there's a progression, is that in the days and weeks after the election itself, there's a lot of sort of vague supposition about what might have happened. We see Perry, for example, talking about getting the NSA involved, about getting the CIA involved. He has this vague sense that maybe there's something in the intelligence community that has something to do with it. And who knows if he believes that sincerely or if this is just something he's kind of projecting forward. But then, as time goes on, these theories, although they're completely baseless, they get more and more specific. So it's not just, there's a CIA connection. It's, Italy, an Italian defense contractor used military-grade satellites to zap votes away. It's completely unhinged, right? just completely divorced from reality. But the fantasies almost become like more concretized as time goes on. And so by the time January 6th rolls around, you have all these people who've developed incredibly elaborate narratives for what happened and why Trump lost. Everything apart from him getting less votes than Biden, of course.
Yeah.
It's all, a fantasy, but it develops.
It makes the theory about Dominion voting machines being rigged look tame by comparison. Sure. Do you have a sense of where some of this stuff was on YouTube? Some of it appears to be concocted out of thin air. Is there a source that you see these lawmakers going back to as by way of a citation? I mean, and I guess I would also ask, is it your sense that Meadows, do we have any indication that he was taking this to the president? Was this being circulated in the upper echelons of the Oval Office?
So to the first question, I can say that they cast a wide net in terms of what they were taking in. I think that's the most charitable way of putting it. Mm-hmm. Essentially, anything that agreed with their worldview, it seems they would kind of run with. So, we have Paul Gosar, for example, citing an article from a website called Some Witch with a Bee Told Me. I can't say that on TV. Mm-hmm. You have Revolver News, like a far-right news outlet, being a source for some of these people, Breitbart. I mean, it's just kind of all over the spectrum. Random postings online. Italygate in particular just came from this random YouTuber, guy named Brad Johnson. And it just kind of filtered its way in through all these different Republican officials and onward to Mark Meadows. As to whether or not, these were making it to Trump, the evidence we have suggests that yes. There's limited evidence in the texts themselves about, whether or not the information got to Trump. But we've heard from the January 6th committee that Trump was given a lot of this information, that he was bringing it up with DOJ officials who would shoot it down. Again, Italygate, I think people like it because it's sort of the craziest one. Mm-hmm. And that one also, it's not clear if Trump heard about it. Some of the people who pushed it have said that they brought it to him. But that one, I think that's a little bit less clear.
Well, I mean, the Dominion voting machine is a subject of a law. The Dominion voting machines was taken seriously enough that now there is a defamation suit that's making its way through court. I know it's impossible to know what was in the hearts and minds of these lawmakers, but I think it's important to stress that these are lawmakers. These are not just random people on the internet trying to get in Mark Meadows' ear. Some of them were reelected and will be serving in Congress. But also, when you read them, at least on their face, this doesn't look like a group of people grasping for straws. There is a true believer element to all of this. I can't necessarily say the same for Mark Meadows, who is obviously a political operative and working with a specific end, working towards a specific end. Did you get a sense in reading all of this that there is the passion, the sort of zealotry of real conversion to this kind of paranoid conspiratorial worldview?
I think zealotry is a really good word. And I would draw your attention to how these people reacted to January 6th, because there was only a very brief window when any of them thought that it was actually, Trump supporters who did it. What they thought was that it was Antifa. And then as weeks went on, when it became clear that wasn't the case, they thought it was the FBI. They started calling it a Fedsurrection. They thought it was Ray Epps. They said he was a Fed. They thought it was the CIA. It doesn't really matter what they believed at any given moment. What matters is that it's convenient, right? What matters is that it doesn't fit with the idea that it was Trump supporters who were responsible for it. So when you say zealotry, I think it's true in that regard. I would draw a line, though, between that kind of just sort of blind belief in conspiracy when it's convenient and specific claims around the election. Mm-hmm. And also maybe specific claims launched not by members of Congress, not by state representatives, but by members of Trump's legal team, mm-hmm. all of whom knew better. Right. I mean, all of these lawyers, they went to fancy law schools. They knew exactly what they were arguing. They knew exactly what they were bringing to court. And they knew, and they had to have known that, the vast majority of the claims they were making were complete bunk.
Yes.
So, again, I would draw a distinction between different kind of players here.
Yes. You have some of these lawmakers are acting in a different way than, for example, John Eastman sure. acted in concocting ways in which one could steal an election. Investigative reporter for Talking Points Memo, Josh Kovensky. Great reporting, Josh. We look forward to much more in the coming days and weeks.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on board.